For this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is how did Gouverneur Morris shape American constitutional principles in the Preamble and as draftsman of the Constitution? Our guest, Dennis Rasmussen, is a professor of political science at my alma mater, Syracuse University, and he is the author of several books, including The Infidel and the Professor, David Hume, Adam Smith, and the Friendship That Shaped Modern Thought, Fears of a Setting Sun, the Disillusionment of America's Founders, and today's topic, the Constitution's penman, Gouverneur Morris, and the creation of America's basic charter. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks in the America 250 series. Dennis, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Sure, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, just a great series of books I've read, and just a great addition to the amazing American political thought series in the University of Kansas Press. So just an important book on a figure we should know more about, but we just don't. Kind of a little lesser known figure.
Yes, absolutely. He's unjustly neglected.
Great. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started then? So I want to say Gouverneur Morris because I've been saying it that way for a long time. I think your book points out that it's probably pronounced governor, so I'll go with that. So Gouverneur Morris is arguably America's most colorful founder. Can you please briefly provide us with some background about him to get started?
I'd be happy to. And yes, he was very colorful. One scholar declared recently that he might have been the most colorful individual in all of North America at the time of the founding, which sounds not totally wrong to me. He was a peg-legged ladies' man with a really wicked, sardonic sense of humor. He was, without question, one of the funniest founders. Now, that's granted not a super high bar, but the founders were an unusually serious lot on the whole. But he and Franklin, I think, had the best senses of humor. So I mentioned that he had a wooden leg. He lost his leg, or he had his leg amputated when he was 28 as the result of a bad carriage accident, although there were always rumors following him throughout his life that he'd in fact shattered the leg jumping out a bedroom window to escape the wrath of an ill-timed husband. So his peg leg does not seem to have dampened his appeal to women. He went on to have a long string of amorous adventures across two continents. So just give you a very brief recap of his life. He's originally from New York. He came from a wealthy family that owned most of the southwest part of what's now the Bronx. But his father died when he was 10. Most of the inheritance went to his older half-siblings from his father's first wife. So he has this kind of quasi-aristocratic lineage. He's left to mostly make his own way in the world, which he does very well. He's both working as a lawyer and especially through land speculation. He's very good at making money. He kind of comes up, as so many of the founders did, through revolutionary politics. He's part of the New York Provincial Congress. He helps to push New York eventually to join, somewhat belatedly, to join the independence movement. He's one of the principal authors of the first New York State Constitution. He then goes on to join the Continental Congress, where he spends the terrible winter at Valley Forge with Washington and the troops. He signs the Articles of Confederation, the nation's first stab at a national. He deems it totally inadequate. He's signing it on behalf of New York, but he signs the Articles of Confederation. He works as deputy superintendent of finance for a while for the Confederation Congress. And then, of course, he attends the Constitutional Convention. I think most of what we're going to talk about today centers on that, so I'll skip that for now. I will say, though, after the convention, Alexander Hamilton urged him to contribute to the Federalist, or what we sometimes call the Federalist Papers. So it's initially supposed to be the trio of Hamilton, Morris, and John Jay, who are all good friends, kind of up-and-coming New Yorkers who wrote the Federalist. And it's only after Morris declined that Hamilton turned to Madison, which makes Madison, as one scholar put it, the most consequential backup choice in the history of political theory. And that's fascinating to think how the Federalist might be different if Morris had written for it instead of Madison. I think we can say for certain Morris would be much more famous today than he is now. Anyway, after the conventions closed, he went to Paris. He eventually followed in the footsteps of Franklin and Jefferson. He became the American minister to France. So he's there at the convening of the Estates General. He's the only foreign diplomat from any country who stays in the country all the way through the Terror. He's skeptical of the French Revolution from the get-go, even before Edmund Burke. And I think a lot of his warnings about the chaos that the revolutionaries would unleash were borne out. When things are at its worst, he hides people in his apartment from the guillotine. So he sees plenty of violence very, very close up. He travels around a little bit in Europe for a few more years, comes back, serves the second half of a senatorial term from 1800 to 1803. In 1804, after the famous duel between Hamilton and Aaron Burr, Morris is the one who sits at Hamilton's side at his deathbed. He gives the official eulogy at the request of Hamilton's widow, Eliza. Eliza says, Morris, you're the best friend he had in the world, which, as most viewers will know, was not enough to earn him even a bit role in the musical, which is a total shame, real missed opportunity to have this peg-legged rake dancing around on the stage. Anyway, I'll be brief here. Late in life, he undertook two more great projects. He helped to lead a commission that planned the grid layout for the streets of Manhattan, and also another commission that planned the Erie Canal. And then in his very last years as a sort of elder statesman in the Federalist Party, he grew so disenchanted with the ascendancy of the Republicans, with the War of 1812, that he supported the secession of New England and New York from the Union. One more fact I have to include, even his death was colorful, if rather grisly. And I'm never sure whether to say this, but my 12-year-old son thinks I should. So here goes. Morris seems to have frequently suffered from painful blockages in his urinary tract, perhaps as a result of venereal disease. And when he was 64, he tried using a whalebone to remove the blockages, and it killed him. He died from the resulting lacerations. So good luck.
I don't know if I wanted to know that, but so but maybe I should have asked you what didn't he do rather than
Sure.
what did he. Wow, just an amazing public and also colorful private life. So going back to the convention, so as you point out in the book, he spoke an awful lot at the convention and was quite influential in all the deliberations, and he becomes the draftsman of the final document. So what was his just general importance at the convention, and before we get to some of the specifics?
Sure. And I do think he is at least arguably the single dominant figure at the Philadelphia Convention. He spoke more often than any other delegate. He proposed more motions than any other delegate. He had more of his motions accepted than any other delegate. His speech, if you read through Madison's notes, his speeches, his interventions are super blunt and provocative. They all but leap off the page at you when you read through Madison's notes. He serves on a number of important committees. He's just kind of everywhere that summer. He and most importantly, as you've already suggested, he wrote the Constitution itself. At the end of the summer, the delegates created what was called a committee of style to write the final draft of the Constitution. And all evidence suggests the committee just basically had Morris do it, which is just unbelievable to me that so few people know this. Everyone knows. Most American school children can tell you that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Right? Very few people know that Morris wrote the Constitution. I bet if you polled PhDs in political science, I don't know what the percentage would be, but it'd be a small number who could tell you that. I've never done a formal poll, but I've asked many people this question over the past few years, and most assume that Madison wrote it, right? That the so-called father of the Constitution, or that it was just a collective effort. And in some senses, of course, it was, right? The Constitution's provisions had been laboriously debated and voted on over the course of the summer. So it's not like Morris could just choose the structure of powers of the government on its own say so. But still, I think it's fair to say that Morris wrote the Constitution every bit as much as Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He radically reorganized. So there's an earlier draft Constitution produced by what was called the Committee of Detail midway through the summer, has sprawling 23 articles. He condenses it down to 7. He changed or chose a great deal of the wording on his own initiative, oftentimes in consequential ways. And so when constitutional lawyers and scholars pore over the fine details of the document, right? Why this word rather than that word? Why this semicolon here? We have Morris to thank or to blame, as it were, for these details. And he wrote the famous Preamble, the Constitution's ringing statement of purpose, basically from scratch, right? So all the stuff about forming a more perfect union, establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, that's all Morris. And so, again, the basic point is he was certainly more than anyone else the author of the Constitution, this charter by which we still live, one of the most important texts in all of world history.
Okay, awesome. And so let's dig around in some of those specifics then. So what were his views regarding the shape of the legislative branch in Article 1?
Well, there's a lot that could be said here.
Right.
In terms of the biggest debate, so the the biggest debate that the delegates spent the whole summer wrestling over is the question of the basis of representation in Congress, and especially the Senate. So they agreed pretty early on that the House of Representatives was going to be proportional to population. And so the real question is the Senate also going to be proportional to population, or is it going to be equal for each state or something else? And Morris was firmly in the typical large state camp, which is to say he's firmly in favor of proportional representation in both houses of Congress. He thought, like the other sort of national-minded delegates, he thought it was patently unfair, patently unjust to grant some people more effective political power just because they happen to hail from a smaller state, as equal state representation would do and does do. And so this is what we tend to think of the Connecticut Compromise, right? Proportional representation in the House, equal representation in the Senate. We tend to think of this as a nice, happy compromise, even Steven compromise. Most of the big names among the founders, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, Morris, James Wilson, others, took it as a devastating defeat. Morris was almost ready to leave the convention altogether, and just in disgust after this compromise was made. There's plenty more that could be said. Let me just say maybe one more thing about what he says about his vision for Congress, especially the Senate, because he has very counterintuitive view of how the Senate should be constructed. He argues in a very long, audacious speech, he argues that the Senate should be made up exclusively of wealthy individuals who are chosen by the president to serve for life without pay. And strangely, he thinks that this is going to serve to check the political power of the rich. So why? Well, first of all, why does he want it to look like this? He says, look, the main purpose of the Senate is to combat the sort of what he assumes will be the turbulent populism of the House of Representatives. And he thinks a Senate, as he's envisioned it, would do that, right? The fact that they're all rich, they have an incentive to protect private property against inroads against it. Their lifetime appointments give them the independence and the security, right? They're not looking over their shoulder at the next election. And this is something that a surprisingly large number of delegates advocated, having the Senate be a kind of quasi-aristocratic body with lifetime appointments and the like. But most of the other delegates advocate this because basically they just trust wealthy elites more than the common people. Morris weirdly advocates this because he doesn't trust them. He's constantly saying the rich are corrupt, they're power hungry, they're always out to oppress the poor. And so the obvious question is, well, then why just basically hand the Senate over to these corrupt people? And his argument, I don't think is persuasive, but it's interesting. He says, well, actually, the rich are going to be easier to restrain if we sort of isolate them, confine them to the Senate. Now we can, the people's representatives in the House can scrutinize their every move, watch them like a hawk, be at the ready to resist any oppressive measures they try to pass. John Adams suggests something similar. He refers to giving the rich the Senate as a sort of ostracism, or ostracizing the rich to the Senate. So again, this is not without its problems. I do not recommend this today, but this is his vision. It's not going to be congenial to a lot of people, but that's his vision.
Right. Well, the Anti-Federalists were fearful of the Senate being sort of a cabal of corruption. I can't imagine if Morris had got his way what they would have thought. So,
yes.
Yeah. So, so what were his views regarding then the executive branch in Article 2, especially in terms of the powers of the office and the term in office and selection by the Electoral College, et cetera?
Sure. So he was, I'd say, along with James Wilson, he's one of the two chief architects of the presidency as we know it. He was much more influential in the debates over the presidency than in Congress. So you asked about presidential selection. How is the president to be chosen? That's, I'd say, the second biggest issue, the issue that the delegates wrangled over more than any other issue besides the basis of representation in the Senate. And it was a very close run thing. I don't think many people today realize just how close the convention came to having Congress choose the president, which would have gone a long way toward making the American system a parliamentary system rather than a presidential one, to use contemporary terms. Because for almost the entire summer, all but a couple weeks, the plan on the table includes congressional selection of the president. It almost certainly would have prevailed were it not for Morris and I think also Wilson's objections to it. Morris's two main objections to this, to congressional selection, are first, the choice of the president is just going to be determined by partisan or factional infighting. He said it would be like the election of a pope by a conclave of cardinals, and that it would just render the president subservient to Congress, right? It would undermine checks and balances. And so what he advocated, and Wilson, what Morris and Wilson both advocated instead, was direct popular election of the president, just popular vote. Most of the other delegates found this to be utterly preposterous. There was no way of that happening. And so the two of them, again, Morris and Wilson, devised the Electoral College as kind of the closest thing that they could get to a popular election, because it solves some problems with regard to the small states and especially the slave states that maybe we won't get into. But the point is, again, he's one of the two main architects of the Electoral College, but he regards that as a second best. He would have preferred a direct election by the people. In terms of the president's powers, he basically did everything that he could to enhance the president's powers. He wants the president to have pretty broad-ranging power over foreign affairs, a role in setting the legislative agenda. He wants him to have an absolute veto over legislation, meaning a veto that Congress can't override. And most of all, unbelievably expansive appointment powers. So he thinks the president should be able to appoint cabinet officers and federal judges and justices, and remember, even senators unilaterally, no need for congressional approval. And that's, very powerful vision of the presidency. He wanted the president to be powerful enough to stand up to Congress, which he assumes, doesn't turn out to have been the case, but he assumes is going to be the strongest of the three branches and the most dangerous of the three branches. He also wants the presidency to be so strong just because he knows, as everybody knew, that it was a foregone conclusion that the first president was going to be his friend and his political hero, George Washington. So he doesn't get everything that he wants with the presidency, but he gets quite a bit more than he does with regard to Congress.
Right, great. So we've done Article 1, Article 2. Let's do Article 3. And so what are his views for especially that independent judiciary and also the power of judicial review you talk about?
Sure. I mean, there's somewhat less to say here. The delegates spent so much more time on the structure and powers of the presidency and Congress. Sometimes the judiciary seemed like an afterthought in the debates in 1787. So really, to get his vision, you have to glean from small statements here and there. But from what we can tell, he really wanted to make the judiciary a true co-equal branch. This is one reason why he gives it its own article. In most of the earlier drafts of the Constitution, there were a slew of articles on Congress, maybe one or two on the presidency, one on the judiciary. He's the one who chooses the structure that we have now. Article 1, Congress, Article 2, presidency, Article 3, judiciary, to kind of signal that they're true co-equal branches. And he also wants, like the other more kind of national-minded delegates, he wants pretty much what we've got, which is a full system of lower federal courts in addition to the Supreme Court, whereas the more local-minded delegates often wanted just one Supreme Court. And he also wanted the courts to be armed with the power of judicial review, as you suggested, in order to keep Congress in check, and I think especially the state governments in check.
Right, great. So maybe a more expansive topic, but Morris had a very strong antipathy towards what he considered to be, the more wrong, the immorality of the institution of slavery. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and what happens at the convention?
I'd be happy to, because this is his, almost certainly his finest hour at the convention from today's perspective. In these debates over slavery, no one speaks more passionately or eloquently or at greater length about the evils of slavery than he does. He called it a nefarious institution. It's the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. I've just pulled up that he gave a long speech on August 8th. I'll read a section from it in a minute. It's been called the first abolitionist speech in American public life, which is maybe an exaggeration, but has some truth to it. So just to set the context, he's giving this speech in opposition to the 3/5 clause, right, to counting 3/5 of the enslaved population toward representation in the House of Representatives, and hence also, at least eventually, the Electoral College. And his basic point is there's no good reason why enslaved people should count at all, according to any ratio, right? If enslaved people are human beings, as he believed, well, then make them citizens, let them vote, right? Then you can count them. But if they're mere property, as the Southern delegates contended, well, then he thought they shouldn't be included at all, right? No other property is counted toward representation, horses or cattle or land or whatever. And so as he saw it, the 3/5 clause is just a way of augmenting the political power of the South, the slave-holding South, in doing so in a way that encourages them to import still more enslaved people, so their political clout is further increased. So anyway, I want to read, if I can, just the kind of climax of his speech
Please.
in opposition to this clause. So he says this: "The admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia or South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondage, shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice." And I won't keep reading, but he goes on to say that giving the South extra representation on behalf of these people whom he's enslaved would require a sacrifice of every principle of right, of every impulse of humanity. Right? So talk about being on the right side of history. This is what you or I would say, or wish we had the guts to say if we had been there. And of course, for all of his moral clarity and passion and eloquence, he doesn't achieve that much, right? The 3/5 clause is included against his objections, the clause protecting the overseas slave trade till 1808, the fugitive slave clause, all over his fierce objections. So what I suggest in the book is he's effectively the framer's conscience on this issue. But as all too often happens, that conscience is sometimes ignored. I'll say just one more thing about this, which is, of course, Morris's speech here makes him look pretty good from today's perspective. I also think it makes the other founders look worse by comparison, in the sense that, historians are always telling us, don't judge figures of the past on the basis of today's values, which I guess is true to a certain extent, that we shouldn't do that. But this speech of Morris's makes it harder for me to accept the idea that, the poor founders, they're mere creatures of their times. They simply didn't know any better. They couldn't possibly have known any better with regard to slavery. Morris was one of them, and he knew better, and he told them so, right? It's true that he's a Northerner, but he came from a slaveholding family. So his father owned or held in bondage several dozen people when he was a kid, when Morris was a child. His mother still held 3 enslaved people when she died the year before the convention in 1786. But for whatever reason, Morris is very clear-sighted about the evils of this institution. He fought against it as far back as the New York State Constitution the New York State Constitutional Convention in 1777. This is at a point he's still 25 years old. He's just comparatively a kid. Slavery is still legal and practiced in every state, and he fights against it that early. So he's just, again, he's at his courageous, far-sighted best when it comes to slavery.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems what you're saying is that, like Benjamin Rush and John Jay and some others, like he recognized that there was a contradiction between the natural law and natural rights principles that they were espousing, and with that institution that denied that very humanity and those natural rights and so forth. So he's really confronting that contradiction of the founding really head on.
Sure.
Yep. So, so back to our original question. How did Gouverneur Morris shape American constitutional principles in the preamble and as draftsman of the Constitution, to wrap us up?
Okay, so on the preamble, so again, he wrote the preamble basically from scratch. So there was a draft preamble in the Committee of Details draft Constitution, but it was a very simple one. All it said was, "We, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Providence, Plantation, so on down the Atlantic seaboard, do ordain and establish this Constitution." So none of the stuff about forming a more perfect union, establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, all those things are added by Morris. So we get all the kind of substantive aims, the statement of purpose, as it were, straight from Morris. We also get substituting, "We, the people of the states of X, Y, and Z, we, the people of the United States." And this has obvious kind of nationalist overtones to it, right? What is in the first draft is unclear. Does the Constitution rest on the authority of the people or the states? It's the people of the states, so it's ambiguous. Whereas when he's done with it, it's "we, the people of the United States." It's clear that it's a government of the people as a whole, the country as a whole, not a creature of the states or state governments. In terms of drafting the Constitution, here I have to reference, there's a great and important law review article by a guy named William Traynor, who is for a long time the dean of Georgetown Law School. He's still at Georgetown Law. He wrote in the Michigan Law Review a couple of years ago an article called "The Case of the Dishonest Scrivener." And Traynor goes through and compares the kind of draft constitution and all the provisions that were given to Morris to write up the final draft, what he gets, and then what the output is, and very carefully goes through and compares the language and the provisions, and tries to look at, does Morris make any substantive changes? He argues that Morris makes, I think it's 13 small but sometimes very important substantive changes, all pushing in his own capital F federalist or kind of national-minded direction. I obviously can't go through all 13 of them now, but I do recommend to viewers this law review article, which is very light, and it's like 100 pages. It's very thorough. If you want to know what thoroughness looks like, take a look at that article, and that makes the case better than I could about the impact of him as the draftsman.
All right, well, we'll check that out. But first, we will all check out the Constitution's penman. Dennis Rasmussen, I want to thank you very much for joining us to discuss your latest book. So congratulations on that.
Thanks again. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining us for this latest episode of Scholar Talks in the America 250 series. Please check out the other videos in our series and go ahead and click subscribe on our channel. Thanks.